To understand why the water vanished, we need to rewind to the deal nobody saw. The triangle that powers the world. 3 high deserts form a tilted crown at the top of South America: Chile's Salar de Atacama, Bolivia's Uyuni, and Argentina's Hombre Muerto. Wind-scrubbed, glacier-fed, almost airless at altitude, they sit inside closed bowls called endorheic basins. No river carries their water to the sea. Whatever falls here stays here, trickling through volcanic gravels, pooling under salt. Life learned to be careful. Investors learn to be fast. On paper, the Lithium Triangle looks simple. Some of the world's largest lithium resources, shallow, brine-borne, and cheaper to pump than to dig. But that's the first sleight of hand. Reserves aren't the same as extractability. The geography is financialized twice. First by geology, which decides how fast ions move through pore spaces. Then by capital, which decides how fast companies must move to hit quarterly targets. Here's the crazy part. The water accounting that props this up depends on a definition. Brine, salty groundwater concentrated beneath the salars, is labeled not water. Freshwater, thin lenses around the basin margins, gets counted separately. On spreadsheets, one can be mined without touching the other. In the ground, they're connected by pressure, gravity, and time. Atacama shows the scale. Together, 2 operators pull roughly 63 billion liters of brine a year, about 2,000 liters every second, day and night. The pitch says they aren't using water because the brine can't be drunk, but the cone of drawdown that forms when you pump a lake under salt crust doesn't respect procurement categories. It pulls laterally. It tugs on freshwater at the edges. Community wells read the loss long before a balance sheet does. Satellite studies later confirmed the physical consequence. Parts of the salar are subsiding by up to 2 centimeters a year as pressure bleeds, permanent storage lost even if rains return. From the ridge, a quinoa farmer watches the dust lift where a spring once bled into grass. He grew up counting on a shallow well that his grandfather dug with a shovel. Now the bucket brings up water that tastes like a coin. Llamas don't drink it. He trucks barrels when he can, and when he can't, he culls. Meanwhile, in boardrooms oceans away, models treat brine like a bottomless input. Valuations ride assumptions about infinite ponds, perfect sun, and cheap separation. If the aquifer slows, the story breaks. So the story can't slow. That's how a desert becomes a schedule. To understand why this felt safe for so long, go under the crust. In these basins, freshwater sits like a skim over a denser brine body, separated not by a solid line but by gradients. Picture a soft interface moving with seasons and pressure. Start pumping brine from the center, and you create a slope toward the wells. Over months, then years, freshwater moves inward to replace the brine volume lost to evaporation ponds. The community pump at the margin has to chase the falling level. The taste shifts, so does the soil. Scientists call it induced lateral flow. Locals call it the year the tamarugos dropped their leaves early. What nobody knew at first was how far the effect would travel or how fast. Monitoring networks were sparse. Some wells were company-run, some provincial, some broken. Uncertainty did work it was never supposed to do. It filled budget gaps with optimism. Meanwhile, the brine itself took a long path to market. After it's pumped, it sits through 12 to 24 months of evaporation, a slow choreography of ponds that strips out what you don't want and leaves more of what you do. This is cheap on energy and brutal on time. When prices rise, the fix is more pumping, bigger ponds, faster turnover. When prices fall, sunk costs keep the pumps on anyway. Either way, the lever is water. Here's where it gets interesting. Even as companies insist on the separation of brine and freshwater in law, the land keeps showing the connection in fact. Springs that fed flamingo lagoons thin out. Vegetation rings around wetlands contract. Satellite data begins to pick up subsidence, millimeters stacking into centimeters, as the aquifer loses pressure and the sediments compact. Once that storage space collapses, it doesn't rebound with the next good winter. The basin forgets how to hold. In Uyuni, a young teacher marks her attendance sheet with a pencil stub and a smile that's turned into a habit. Her students draw salt flats with cranes and trucks. Their parents argue about whether to take the stipend from a community fund tied to production or to fight for stricter baselines first. The stipend buys diesel. Baselines feel like paperwork. Meanwhile, The well outside the school swings a little lower each dry season. All of this maps onto a market story that sounds clean. Batteries turn sunlight into motion and cut tailpipe emissions. That's true, and it matters. But the same physics that lets lithium shuttle charge between electrodes also makes it rare in the right concentrations. The cheapest way to gather it here is to evaporate enormous volumes of groundwater in a place that barely has any to spare. And the plan only works if everyone agrees that brine isn't water. That's the hinge. Because the deeper truth is this: what keeps the brine moving toward the pumps is the same head that keeps freshwater moving toward the roots. Change the pressure and both respond. The money only flows if the water keeps flowing up and out of the ground. The evaporation gambit, killing water to print lithium. Start at the pond edge where the wind stings with salt. Brine comes up from wells in the Sala's center and pours into a staircase of rectangles, each pond a little saltier than the last. It'll sit there for 12 to 24 months while the sun does unpaid labor, boiling off what companies refuse to call water. Operators like it because sunlight is free and diesel is not. Markets like it because the timeline looks predictable. But the clock is actually hydrology, and it runs on pressure you can't see. To understand the trick, think in layers. Under the salt crust, dense brine fills the basin's belly. Along the edges, thinner freshwater rides like a skin over coarser sediments, feeding springs and shallow wells. When the pumps at the center start pulling, they lower the brine's pressure. That pressure drop creates a drawdown cone, a sloping surface that tilts everything toward the wells. Over weeks, then months, freshwater at the margins responds to the same pressure gradient. It begins to move inward, laterally, to replace the volume being evaporated into blue sky. Here's where it gets interesting. On ledges, companies separate brine from freshwater with clean lines and separate permits. In the ground, the line is fuzzy and moving. Induced lateral flow is the phrase hydrogeologists use. Communities feel it in their hands when the rope goes 5 extra cranks before the bucket hits water. In Atacama, this happens at industrial scale. Together, 2 operators pump on the order of 63 billion liters of brine a year, about 2,000 liters a second. The ponds stretch like a chessboard, the pumps hum, the drawdown cone deepens. Then the feedbacks arrive. As brine ponds grow, capillary action wicks salts upward at the edges, building crusts that brighten the surface. Brighter surfaces reflect more sunlight, heat the air differentially, and change local wind patterns. When the wind rips later, it lifts salt dust into plumes that drift into pastures. Alfalfa browns first at the tips, then across whole rows. Flamingo lagoons, once buffered by steady spring flow, thin into patchy mirrors. Nesting cycles miss a season. Then too, what nobody knew at first was how fast the basin's body would sag. Satellite interferometry started to answer. Millimeters of ground movement added up to centimeters, then headlines, portions of the salt flat subsiding by up to 2 centimeters a year. That's not just the surface sinking, it's the aquifer's scaffolding losing pressure and compacting. Once pore spaces collapse, they don't reopen with a wet winter. The storage is gone. The basin forgets how to hold. Meanwhile, a different pressure builds in quarterly reports. Evaporation is slow, demand growth is. The incentive is brutal and simple. The fastest to evaporate wins the quarter. Add more ponds, drill more wells, skim the brine earlier and push it harder through the sequence. Every optimization up top presumes more volume from below. When prices spike, the pace quickens. When prices crash, sunk ponds still need feeding to justify the capex. Either way, the lever stays the same. Unknown to boardrooms, municipal crews across the basin rim are boring deeper. A town that once pulled from 10 meters needs 15, then 20. Pump intakes slide downward, electricity bills climb. The water that comes up tastes a little harder each year. A clinic's records show rashes that weren't common a decade ago. The mine's sustainability report highlights new bird blinds and a school roof. It says impacts are inconclusive. Inconclusive buys time. Here's the catch the models don't like to admit. Brine freshwater segregation isn't a wall, it's an interface that breathes. When you lower brine levels, you not only coax freshwater inward, you risk mixing. Pressure changes and hydraulic shortcuts can push saline fronts into once fresh layers. Farmers call it salinity creep. Hydrologists draw breakthrough curves and warn that once a freshwater lens is salted, The fix isn't measured in election cycles, and DLE reinjection done at the wrong pressure or density can accelerate that mixing. There's another quiet cost. As the brine system loses pressure, springs that used to gush with a steady pulse go erratic. Some sputter and die. Wetland vegetation shrinks in rings, retreating toward the last persistent pools. Flamingo counts on certain transects dip, not every year, not everywhere, but enough to unsettle the biologists who know those routes by heart. They log field notes. They ask for more sensors. The budget moves elsewhere. Now add dust. As edges dry and salts crust, windstorms carve and carry. The air takes on a metallic tang, sunsets flare strange. A grandmother wipes her windows each morning and mutters that the desert's taste is wrong. Her son drives a water truck for the mine because the quinoa didn't pencil last season. Says the job is steady. He doesn't say the water he delivers used to flow on its own. Get this, the Gambit looked efficient because the sun did the work. But the system worked only by killing water twice, first in the ponds, then in the basin's capacity to store it. The project's success hinged on keeping the brine moving up, out, and gone, while insisting that the freshwater watching from the edges was untouched. For a while, the paperwork agreed. This was the moment the salt line started moving. The water ledger, who owns an aquifer. The salt line moved, and suddenly the fight wasn't about chemistry, it was about paperwork. On one side, mining codes that treat brine like a mineral. On the other, water law that governs rivers, wells, and springs. In between sits an aquifer that doesn't care which statute you cite. Companies hold concessions to extract brine. Communities hold rights to freshwater. Both draw from the same pressure head. The law says they're separate. The basin says they are. Start with permits. A company wins a license to pump a fixed volume of brine from production wells inside the Sala. The permit specifies rates, depths, and reporting. There's also a smaller separate permit for industrial freshwater, wash water for equipment, worker camps, chemical dilution. On spreadsheets, the brine volume is counted to the liter, audited quarterly, and disclosed in glossy ESG reports. Freshwater is capped too. What falls between the columns is what moves laterally, the seepage that never shows up as use, the induced flow that shifts the freshwater brine interface without crossing a meter. Here's where it gets interesting. Regulators often ask for water balances, in, out, stored. But the stored line is a guess if the monitoring network is thin. Drawdown in the brine body isn't just vertical, it spreads as a cone that radiates toward the margin. That movement isn't recorded as a company taking freshwater, it's recorded as nature responding. The accounting trick is subtle. Brine extracted is a number. Freshwater lost to induced flow is a geometry. Geometry doesn't fit well in a ledger. Meanwhile, the legal categories diverge. In several jurisdictions, brine is treated as a mining resource under national codes, while freshwater sits with provincial or local water authorities. That split creates a gray zone. A mine can be in perfect compliance with its brine quota, while nearby municipalities deepen wells to chase a falling water table. On paper, nobody violated their freshwater cap. In practice, the cone dragged it inward. Permits didn't lie, they just didn't talk to each other. Unknown to the contracts team, languages carry weight here too. Brine is not water isn't just a slogan, it's a risk shield. If brine isn't water, then brine extraction can't violate water rights. But that line collapses when courts ask about causality. Communities point to salinity creeping into shallow wells, to springs that fed lagoons flickering out. Operators counter with variability, drought cycles, El Niño, climate change. They offer mitigation, more monitoring wells, dust suppression, community funds. They ask for time. Indigenous consultation sits at the center of the dispute. The law requires prior consultation. Communities expect consent with teeth. What they often get is process, meetings, minutes, and memoranda of understanding that promise jobs, roads, and a share of royalties. The problem is substance. If the agreement doesn't hardwire hydrologic baselines, levels, flows, salinity thresholds, then the benefit fund becomes a payment for loss that isn't measured until it's permanent. A stipend can buy diesel for a water truck, it can't buy a spring back. Accounting gaps multiply in the details. Production reports list brine volumes with precision, but seepage and evaporation outside the ponds rarely get the same rigor. Incidental, freshwater use dust control, road compaction, emergency drilling lands in categories that don't add up across agencies. Monitoring wells are calibrated one year, silted the next. A storm takes out a data logger. The baseline slides. This was the moment everything changed for a small town at the basin's edge. The mayor held up two maps in a community hall. The first, a government hydrograph with a flat line bouncing gently around a median. The second, a farmer's notebook with hand-drawn levels from a single well dropping month by month. The official record said stable. The notebook said otherwise. "Which one do you drink?" he asked. The room went quiet. Insurance enters when silence breaks. Policies often exclude gradual pollution or subsidence, pushing hydrologic failure into force majeure, the clause that forgives obligations when nature intervenes. But when nature's nudge is amplified by pumps, whose ledger carries the loss? If a flamingo lagoon dies and tourism collapses, does that trigger business interruption for a community, or is it an externality? Lenders read those clauses closely. So do operators, facing covenant deadlines that demand output regardless of rainfall. Here's the catch the contracts didn't predict. Evidence arrives slower than invoices. Springs fade over seasons, loan payments come monthly. A plant meets its extraction target to satisfy a covenant. Villages roll water in plastic tanks past the mine gate. The sustainability report notes inconclusive hydrologic impact and highlights community investments. The aquifer keeps its own books. Across a border, another fight. A provincial water board denies a freshwater expansion request from a mine after dry years. The company responds by optimizing brine pumping and accelerating pond turnover. The interface shifts again. Technically, nobody touched the freshwater cap. Practically, more freshwater is now acting like brine, moving where the pressure tells it to. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly subsidence would turn legal into physical. As the aquifer compacts, storage capacity vanishes. Even if a tribunal orders a cutback, recovery lags for years, if it comes at all. That delay makes liability slippery. If baseline breach shows up after a project sunsets, who pays the bond? If the state approved the permits without integrating hydrology across categories, who owns the mistake? Get this, the water ledger that matters isn't the one filed at quarter's end. It's the one the basin keeps in pressure and salt. Until permits, property, and consultation reflect that ledger, compliance can coexist with collapse. While the paperwork said it was fine, the birds and wells said otherwise. The $80 trillion number, where it comes from. The first time you hear it, it sounds like 80 trillion, but it isn't a single market, it's a stack of bets. Start with the visible layer, electric vehicles. Automakers retooled their factories and told investors a battery future was inevitable. Share prices absorbed that promise. Then add battery makers scaling to terawatt-hours. Analysts projected the lithium-ion chain could be worth more than $400 billion annually by 203. Layer on utilities planning grid storage, miners expanding capacity, and traders writing contracts on top of contracts. Each layer assumes the one below holds. Here's where it gets interesting. Those assumptions aren't about cars or cathodes, they're about geology behaving like finance. A factory runs on schedules, an aquifer runs on seasons. Bankers price the difference as if sunlight and evaporation were production lines. Take-or-pay offtake agreements locked in volumes years ahead. Loan covenants tied cash to output, not to rainfall. Futures curves and Spakira decks projected smooth supply from salt that took millennia to accumulate. The spreadsheet said yes, the basin hadn't been asked. To understand the $80 trillion, follow the risk transfers. An automaker commits to buy lithium chemicals for a decade to de-risk battery plants. A miner signs that offtake to unlock financing. A lender accepts the miner's reserves and flow models as collateral. A rating agency blesses the structure if the covenants force production. Insurers write policies to cover equipment, not hydrology. Every signature pushes uncertainty down the chain until it lands where it can't push back, the water table. Investors loved brine because the cost curve looked flat. Compared to hard rock, the energy needed at the mine gate is low. The sun does most of the concentrating. Margins expand when prices rise, they don't vanish when prices fall. In theory, it's resilient. In practice, the lever is volume. To keep cost per ton steady, you keep the ponds fed. If demand accelerates, you drill more wells and extend the chessboard. If prices soften, you still need volume to amortize sunk ponds and fixed plant. This is how renewable demand yoked itself to non-renewable pressure. What nobody knew at the time, or admitted on roadshows, was how tight the bottlenecks would get further downstream. Cathode plants cap throughput, refineries set purity gates, logistics tangle at high-altitude roads and drought-choked ports. So the market priced chemistry risk and factory risk, then discounted geological risk because the basins looked endless from a satellite. That discount shows up in market caps. It shows up when automakers announce $500 billion in electrification spending and analysts fold it into the green economy total. Stack equities, bonds, offtakes, and derivatives across sectors, and you reach for that 80 trillion label. It's not a category, it's an exposure. Meanwhile, derivatives multiplied. Traders wrote swaps on battery metals. Funds securitized expected production. Prepayment deals advanced cash today for tons tomorrow, turning ponds into collateral. A miner meeting a lone milestone by pumping harder is a financial outcome dressed as geology. The take-or-pay clause that penalizes shortfalls regardless of drought is finance at war with weather. Confidentiality provisions in offtakes kept water audits quiet, not because water was irrelevant, but because transparency could spook lenders. Investors bet on chemistry, the ground quietly voted with water. Run a sensitivity test and the number twitches. Nudge aquifer deliverability down 5% basin-wide for 2 years. Now roll that reduction into brine output, into concentrate arrivals at refineries, into cathode lines waiting for raw material. Automakers miss quarterly targets, then compliance credits. Balance sheets sag. Credit spreads widen. Funds rebalance out of suppliers. The repricing ripples, not because drivers stopped wanting EVs, but because an invisible pressure plane shifted under a desert 6,000 miles from the showroom. Get this, what held the tower up wasn't just demand euphoria, it was the belief that brine supply was elastic. In analyst notes, elasticity looked like adding ponds and pumps. In hydrology, elasticity looked like time you didn't have. The mismatch hid inside acronyms, EBITDA tied to throughput, DSCR tied to cash flow, both blind to subsidence data showing parts of a Salar sinking centimeters a year. If the aquifer compacts, storage is lost. Even if rain returns, capacity doesn't. That isn't a cyclical dip, it's a step change. There's another irony. Battery chemistries already started shifting to reduce dependence on scarce metals, LFP gaining share against nickel-rich cathodes. Sodium-ion pilots appeared on slides, yet the valuation stack still treated lithium as if cost and volume would glide. Demand curves bent upward, while the cheapest supply sat in basins where every liter removed tightened the loop between finance and water. Carbon math dazzled. Water math, 63 billion liters a year in Atacama, with parts subsiding up to 2 centimeters annually, stayed off stage. Final detail pulls the number into focus. When the price spiked, new contracts shortened ramp timelines and stiffened penalty. Projects raced to feed a peak. When the price fell, sunk investments demanded utilization. Either way, the contracts made pumping rational even as hydrology waved a red flag. That's how a market can point to a clean future while quietly assuming a desert will forget its past. The tower stands as long as the base stays they don't want. Hard rock versus brine versus DLE. While that tower of finance leaned on brine, another path kept knocking at the door: dig rock. In Australia's green hills and Canada's boreal edges, miners blast spodumene from hard granite, crush it, float it, and ship a concentrate to refineries. It's loud, steep on energy, and honest about what it is: mining. At the pit, water use is lower than a desert pond farm, but the energy bill is higher. Diesel for trucks, power for mills. Heat for kiln-like converters that turn spodumene into something refineries can digest. It trades water stress for energy intensity, and it does it in places where rain still falls. Here's where it gets interesting. On a spreadsheet, brine beats rock at the mine gate. Low ore handling, the sun works for free, but brine's advantage depends on time and water in places that have neither to spare. Hard rock's edge hides downstream, a tighter, faster supply line you can schedule. Quarries don't wait for evaporation. You cut, crush, rail, refine. If you have grid power that's clean and stable, the carbon math can pencil better than you think. If you don't, diesel and coal show up in your LCA and the glow fades. Either way, the pivot question isn't purity, it's pressure, whose pressure you choose to spend. Meanwhile, the industry's escape hatch arrived with a promise: direct lithium extraction. DLE would skip months of evaporation by pulling lithium ions straight from brine with sorbents and membranes, then send the brine back underground. No giant ponds, smaller footprints, closed loops. Get this, the marketing slides wrote themselves. But the plants didn't. Chemistry fought back. Sorbents swelled and degraded. Fouling choked columns. The brine cocktail changed with seasons and wells. What worked on a bench stalled at scale. The catch nobody wanted to headline: most DLE trains need significant freshwater to wash and strip the captured lithium from the sorbent. Pilots have requested volumes that shocked communities who were told this was the waterlight fix. And the reinjection step, the heart of the promise, carries its own hydrologic risks. Push spent brine back into the basin at pressure, and you can shove saline fronts into once fresh layers. Mix the wrong density at the wrong depth, and you build a shortcut that unravels the very separation the paperwork depends on. The interface breathes, and you just taught it to pant. Operators under covenant clocks do the math. If DLE skips evaporation, you move inventory faster, but you trade a visible cost, pond acreage, for invisible flows, wash water, reagents, power, and subsurface pressure management. Pumps hum either way. The question is what they hum for. Some pilots string DLE onto existing ponds, using columns to boost the tail end of concentration. Others dream of all-column systems that feed a reactor straight from wells. Both dreams hit the same wall: scale. You don't test a basin's patience on a skid. You test it with a train yard of units and pipelines that must run without stopping. There's a political undertow here. Moving from brine to rock shifts power. The Andes lose leverage, Australia and Canada gain it. Hard rock mines rise where unions are strong, courts move faster, and ports already ship bulk minerals by the boatload. Processing follows, pulled by clean power and policy carrots. The midstream, the refineries and cathode plants, start to relocate to grids with wind and solar, or to industrial parks with nuclear baseload. Brine nations watch value slip offshore as concentrates and chemicals are priced where water isn't the binding constraint. The geopolitics of green looks like the old map, just with different colors. Investors try to arbitrage the difference. They back DLE announcements to keep brine optionality alive. They fund hard rock to keep timelines short. They hedge with chemistry, shifting toward LFP cathodes that don't need nickel or cobalt, and toy with sodium-ion pilots that flirt with less lithium. But the big car makers still write offtakes that prefer certainty over novelty. They finance mines. They sign take-or-pay clauses. They don't like waiting for chemistry to grow up when production lines are hungry now. Here's the part the market whispers about. Even if a DLE breakthrough lands tomorrow, the basin it lands in won't be the same. Reinjection changes pressure regimes. You need injection wells mapped, tested, and monitored for years. You need tracer studies and seismic lines. You need to know where the spent brine will go when it hits a fault. All of that takes time, sensors, trust. Without it, you risk fixing evaporation while breaking storage. And once storage is broken, you can't buy it back with a water truck. Meanwhile, hard rock keeps running. It's modular. You can add a new pit or a new line. You can site refineries where power is clean and abundant, hydro in Quebec, wind in Western Australia. You can recycle heat. You can measure everything. The trade is transparent. More energy at source for less water in a desert. In a water-first world, that's not a minor detail. It's the pivot. But the pivot they don't want is the one that admits the premise was wrong. It says the cheapest lithium on paper came from the most expensive water in practice. It says contracts need hydrologic KPIs alongside tons. It says finance has to accept slower ramps while chemistry and reinjection science catch up. It says the brine advantage was borrowed time. If DLE worked at scale tomorrow, one detail would still haunt the Andes. Reinjection changes the basin forever.